Hi, everybody. My name is Jamie McLeod-Skinner, and I'm running to be Oregon's next Secretary of State. I'm running to protect our democracy, make government more accountable, and safeguard our environment. We're joined today with two wonderful guests on our Oregon Voices Roundtable to talk about voter preference and intent, how to better capture it. So I'm really excited for this conversation today. Let me just start out by making a couple of notes, and then we'll go into introductions, and then we'll get right to our conversation. And first of all, the Secretary of State role, just a little bit of background on it. It's an executive management position that manages over 220 employees, over 200 employees, oversees multiple divisions, including elections, audits, business registration, state archives, is one of three that serves on the State Land Board, is an ex officio member of the State Board of Education, serves as a de facto lieutenant governor. We don't have a lieutenant governor here in Oregon, so the Secretary of State serves in that capacity, and is backstop for redistricting, that is redrawing our political boundaries every 10 years if the legislature walks out. So part of the role of Secretary of State is to educate voters. And I take that very seriously. So I'm providing these Oregon Voices Roundtable on issues related to our elections and of interest to voters. And so today's topic is about how can we improve our elections? And it's about capturing voter preferences. So the two methods that are getting a lot of attention and we'll talk about today are ranked choice voting and star voting. And like I said, I've got two wonderful guests with me. But just before we begin, I wanted to kick this off and give a shout out to one of our frequent live stream listeners, Lieutenant Theland, who is on active duty military personnel stationed outside of Oregon. Thank you so much for your service to our country. And thanks for being an engaged Oregon voter. So stay safe, and we look forward to welcoming you home at some point. So on introductions, let me start by just giving a little bit of my background. I'm an Ashland High graduate, degrees in engineering planning and law with a focus on natural resource law, water law, and Indian law. Began my public service managing the reconstruction of schools and hospitals over in Bosnia and Kosovo. Worked in refugee resettlement, including citizenship, naturalization, helping people become voters. And then also served in local government, served 9 years in elected office, 8 years on the Santa Clara City Council, and then also serve here in Central Oregon on the Jefferson County Education Service District Board. I'm a natural resource attorney and organizational development consultant. And like I said, my wife and I live in Central Oregon. I also serve all Oregonians on the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board. And I'm turning over now next to Mike Alfoni. Mike is going to talk to us about ranked choice voting. But Mike, please introduce yourself. Give us a bit about your background.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having us, Jamie. Really appreciate it. This is a really, really important topic, I think, right now in our democracy, especially. So I'm glad you're working to shine a light further on systemic change needed here. So as Jamie mentioned, my name is Mike Alfoni. I'm working with a group of folks and on exploring using ranked choice voting and how that might be applied in Oregon. Ranked choice voting is a simple election reform where in candidate races with more than two candidates, ballots will allow you to rank your candidates in order of preference. So like first choice, second choice, third choice. I think we can all intuitively understand how this might make a lot of sense, especially given the recent Democratic primary having at one point, what was it, like 17 candidates in the race at one point. And so the problem with that, and one of the problems with that is that voters have a really hard time choosing between the candidate they like the most and want to win and the candidate they may like less but think is more viable. In addition, I think ranked choice voting is important because it creates far more equitable outcomes in places that it's used. More people of color and more women are elected overwhelmingly in places that use ranked choice voting. And so what we're doing is we're having conversations around the state with various organizations and people to figure out, is this something that is a good reform for Oregon, and is this the right time to be doing it?
Well, thanks for that, Mike. Do you want to give us a little bit about your background so we can kind of
Sure.
understand what
Sure.
some of the stuff you've done before? Thanks.
So my background is clearly talking about ranked choice voting, since it's the first thing I do. So I've been around. I've worked in politics for a long time. I worked for a lot of Democrats, and then I worked in the nonpartisan sector on a lot of ballot measures in the past. I got out to the private sector for a while. I did reuse materials with the Rebuilding Center in Portland, ran a makerspace called ADX in Portland for a while, helping incubate small manufacturers and like boosting our artisanal economy, and did some cool little futurism projects for Intel. So But now, sort of as the country's burning down around us, I decided it was time to get back in and see what we can do to fix our democracy.
Fix and protect our democracy. I'm right there with you. And Sara Wolk, thank you so much for joining us. I know a lot of folks have we've sat down together. A lot of folks have heard your presentations. Please give us a bit about your background, and then we'll go on to talking about star voting specifically in a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. So my personal background is in sustainability. So I got involved with sustainable agriculture, with the environmentalism movements, environmental activism specifically, went on to do a lot of work in those sectors, including local agriculture. I ran a CSA farm for a number of years, a couple different places across Oregon. And I'm also a musician, so I love to play music, but really where it all ties in is whether you're talking permaculture design, ecological design, architecture, engineering, it's all systems design. And with voting reform, what we really have is a systematic problem that requires a design-based solution. It's really, these outcomes that we're seeing are designed right into our society. And it actually is an easy fix.
Nice. I love that. One of our sons is a musician. I always joke, I play nothing but the radio, but I always admire folks who have those skills. So our topic today is to really focus on elections and ways that we can improve our elections. Oregon, of course, is a national leader on vote by mail, but what are some of those ways we can improve? You know, there's a lot of talk about same-day registration, making sure postmarks count, campaign finance reform, dropping the voting age. And all of those are important topics, but today we're really going to focus on capturing voter preference. And those are the two types that we're going to talk about today, the ranked choice voting and star voting. Just to say, this is not going to be an exhaustive discussion. And at the end, I'll ask you both to provide us with links of where we can go to get more information. It's also not a debate, it's just informational. The other thing too, we're not going to be talking about the Secretary of State's race or my candidacy. We're just going to be providing folks with information about these two types of ways to capture voter preference. And I think it's really important for voters to have a better sense of this. We're starting to hear about this from different campaigns, and having voters really understand the ways we can better engage and have our voices be heard, I think is what's really prompting this conversation. So as you've heard, we've got two experts, and so let's get on to the topic. I'm going to ask you first about our current voting process and why you think it needs to change. And frankly, I think we could do better myself. So I'm excited to hear this conversation. And then I'm going to ask you to explain both the respective types of voting, ranked choice and star, and then some strengths about both systems. And then we'll run through an example and then open up for questions. And so if folks are listening and are curious, send in some questions in the comment line and we'll get to your questions. So to start off with, what does our current process look like, and why does it need to change? And Sara, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. Yeah. So our current voting system, we like to call it choose one only voting. It's called plurality, first past the post, different things around the world. But basically you choose one candidate only. And a lot of us are familiar with the situation that puts us in where, as Mike said, I might have a favorite, but I don't know if they can win. I don't know if they're viable. I don't know if they're electable. And so especially in elections with more than two candidates, we find ourselves saying, should I be voting lesser evil? Am I risking throwing away my vote or wasting my vote? And should I be strategic? Can I actually vote my conscience? So,
yeah, thank you. So many voters are asked that. And Mike mentioned before that the Democratic primary was a perfect example of having so many different candidates who people were excited about to varying degrees. And then, are we able to show our choice and preference in that process? And because otherwise we've seen it play out sometimes where we don't get much of a choice. Mike, please weigh in. What are some of the other things that need to be said around this, our current process, and why it needs to change?
I mean, I think Sara's really nailing some of the root causes of this. I think that's absolutely right. I think if you kind of abstract out to a larger picture, polarization is increasing in this country to dangerous levels. I mean, I think it was like in the 1960s, it's been a steady decline from about 3 out of 4 people trusting the federal government to it's dipped below 20% recently. In addition, the number of times that Congress is gridlocked has increased from 1 in 4 on important issues to 3 out of 4. Harvard Business School just did an assessment of like things like what is the business and economic environment of America, and things are improving like communications infrastructure, but the worst thing that's deteriorating the fastest is our political system. People, I think, feel like things are on fire right now. And I would say that your gut is right. You don't need a study to show this, but there are studies that show this. Things are on fire right now. Like nothing is written anywhere in the universe that says our republic needs to keep standing. So we need to stand up and do something about that. And that these are the kind of reforms, along with the ones you're mentioning, that are really going to help bring back trust in institutions, re-engage citizens in democracy, and help keep politicians accountable to people rather than special interests. And there's plenty of data to show that what average voters think almost is irrelevant for legislation, whereas money in politics and influence in politics are increasingly driving what happens in American government today. And people see that and they respond by taking their limited time and doing things like not voting, not participating in democracy.
And that's not just at the federal level, it's at the state level as well. I know I've heard from voters across our state who are really frustrated with just the lack of working together, the conflict. And we've seen the last here in Oregon, where we've had the Oregon way and all these theories about us working together. And the last 2 legislative sessions, there have been walkouts. And with redistricting coming up, that's critically important that our system works. And so let's go on to some of the opportunities for more engagement of voters. So Mike, why don't you start us off this time? Tell us about what is ranked choice voting?
So I'll try and keep this part brief because I already covered it by accident earlier. But so ranked choice voting is a simple system where you can rank your candidates like first choice, second choice, third choice, etc. And what happens then is I think a lot of people are probably familiar with runoff elections where you get a bunch of people running and then the winners from that go on and then there's a general election unless it's someone won with over 50%. So it used to be called instant runoff voting, but basically the idea is that you rank your candidates, all the ballots are counted, and if nobody gets a majority, 50% of the votes, the last place candidate's eliminated, and instantaneously their votes are recounted for their second choice and added to those candidates. And that process continues, although it's very rare that it continues past one round with ranked choice voting until someone gets a majority of votes. So an easy example would be like Gore, Nader, Bush, where people who voted for Nader might have put Gore second, and that's and then had their votes transferred where Nader came in last, and nobody had over 50%. I think that's one of the easiest examples in recent history to think of.
The pain of the 2000 election, and I will point out how important the Florida Secretary of State was in that role and in essentially putting her thumb on the scale. But that's a whole other conversation. Sara, let's jump to you. What is star voting?
Yeah, so star voting is really another variation on the preference voting type thing that Mike is talking about. But with star voting, you score your candidates on a scale from 0 up to 5 stars. So star voting allows you to show who your favorite is, who you prefer to who, and also how much or how little do you like the candidates. Your second choice may be just as great as your first choice, or they may be a lesser evil, and you would only ever support them if it came down to it. With star voting, you're able to show that nuance. And voting is counted in 2 rounds. So it also has an automatic runoff, just like the instant runoff in ranked choice voting. So star stands for score, then automatic runoff. You score the candidates up to 5 stars. The 2 highest scoring candidates are finalists. And then the finalist who was preferred on more ballots wins. So the finalist who was preferred by the majority wins.
So theoretically, of the top two selected candidates, the second one, if they're preferred by more voters, they would actually win the election.
Right, and that really does allow us to bring in voters from those minority factions who are often excluded in the process or who really don't like any of the front runners. With star voting, their vote still matters. If your favorite can't win, no worries, your vote automatically goes to the finalist you preferred.
And just as a sense of comparison, Mike, so if you're talking about with ranked choice voting, you remove that bottom one, you just count the existing votes that the top 2 got. Let's say we're it was rotating through to the top two, or would there be any kind of redistribution of the votes? I'm just trying to tease out a little bit of just the distinction of how it would actually play out.
So if you marked candidate A as your favorite and candidate A got like 2% in the election and then was knocked out because no one got the majority of votes yet, and you voted for candidate B as your second choice, your vote then transfers to candidate B, and then maybe candidate B gets over 50%, and then the election is won by candidate B. The
Great,
idea
thank you.
between both systems that they're two different systems of just how to figure out the best way in a system where there is no perfect way of doing this, to really have our elections best express what voters' intent are and keep as many people engaged by not feeling like their voice didn't matter.
Yeah, great, thank you. And then what are some of the respective strengths? Like I said, we're not going to get into a debate on this, but what would you say are some of the real core strengths of the voting system you're talking about today? And we're swapping back and forth. So Sarah, why don't we start with you? What are some of the real key strengths of star voting?
Sure. Yeah. Star voting is a newer system. It was invented in 2014, and it was really set up to address criticisms of previous models. So star voting, unlike other systems, guarantees a majority preferred winner, as opposed to like a majority of remaining ballots or, kind of caveats like that. Star voting ensures that your vote is never wasted. Every vote is counted in that final runoff round. And even if your favorite can't win, your vote automatically transfers to the finalist you preferred if you had a preference. If you didn't have a preference, it's a vote of no preference in the runoff, but your score is still counted towards your candidates and you still help advance your favorites.
Great, thanks.
The third is that star voting actually tops the charts in terms of election accuracy, which can be measured a lot of different ways, no matter how you slice it. Star voting really well elects the candidate who was preferred over all others, or prefers, Star voting really accurately elects the candidate who would make as many voters as possible as satisfied as possible with the election outcome. So the will of the people. And I was trying to cite that exact statistical data term that they use.
Well, we can also reference some sources that people can go to for more detail. Mike, what are some of the great strengths of ranked choice voting?
Well, first, I want to just say that I think star voting is really, really a cool concept. So I'm really glad that this conversation's in the mix and that they're working on it. I understand that they're also going to be used in some the independent parties going to use it for polling of people, and Multnomah County Democrats are also using it to do delegate selection, I believe, of some kind. So I think it's really cool that they're doing this, and just want to make sure that folks know that they're working hard on this new innovative idea. So
yeah,
shout out to you guys.
Just point of clarification, it's the independent party statewide primary is using star voting starting on Tuesday.
Yeah, we'll jump to let's just finish up this point, and then we'll because I want to run through an example and then also talk about where people can look for more information, also see some of these examples where they're being where it's being practiced, so people can actually see it in action. So jumping back, Mike, what are some of the key strengths?
I think the two systems have similar strengths. They approach it from slightly different mechanics. I'll speak to ranked choice voting in that it's a relatively simple change that gives voters the ability to have a simple way of voting for who they want first, and then have their backup options down the road, and not feel like they're disenfranchised because their favorite candidate didn't win, or they felt like they were choosing between the lesser of two evils. One of the things about ranked choice voting is it has a proven track record. It's currently being used to solve a bunch of Voting Act right cases because certain districts were drawn in ways that were unrepresentative, and now it's actually being used as a solution legally in those, because there's so much statistical evidence behind ranked choice voting now, improving outcomes for elections, increasing voter participation, electing more representative bodies in terms of gender and in terms of racial groups, that it's starting to be used as a legal mechanism to help solve gerrymandered districts, which I think is fascinating. So I think that's a big thing for ranked choice voting, is that it's got this proven track record. I think up to 25 states are using it now, so about half the country, and 4 states are using it for the Democratic. We're using it this cycle for the Democratic National Convention as well. New York City just passed it as well.
Great. And I mean, let's jump to the example. So here in Oregon, I believe Benton County is going to be using it in their cycle.
County. Yeah,
Benton County.
5 months of my life doing that. Sorry.
And then Sarah, you mentioned that the Independent Party of Oregon. Now, just to mention that the Independent Party of Oregon is doing something. It's not going to go through our standard ballot process. You won't get one of those in the mail if you're registered with the Independent Party. But they've also opened up their primary to non-affiliated voters. So anyone who's not a registered Republican or Democrat can vote in the Independent Party's primary through Star voting. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, and because it is independent and non-affiliated in Oregon, that's the biggest voting block in our state. Almost a third of Oregonians are registered non-affiliated. And so it's over 1 million voters that'll get to use Star voting for the first time this week.
And but people will have to go to the Independent Party of Oregon's website to access that. I can tell you, as someone who's running as a Democrat on the Democratic for the Democratic nomination, folks who would need to be registered as Democrats, folks who wanted to vote for me, but folks who were, but all candidates are on that Independent Party, or most of them, I think, are on, myself included. So if folks are not registered with one of the major parties and are either non-affiliated or independent or another party, minor party, they can vote in that election. But again, they need to go to that website.
I'll put a link in the comments.
Okay, great, thank you. So people can access that. And that's another one of the issues. Again, it's not the subject of today, but one of those other issues of how can we make sure all voters are able to choose a candidate in the primary, which is one of the things that we need to address. And so it's one of the things that I know the Independent Party is trying to address in this election cycle. So this, the Secretary of State as a role, the role is to educate voters. And so this is the kind of information we're wanting to share, and this is really why I'm having invited my guests to have this conversation. But let's run through an example now. What would it look like? Either, I'm swapping back and forth. Mike, why don't we have you go first? What would be an example of ranked choice voting? Can you share your example with our viewers?
Sure. So let me get my screen share here. And all right, am I successful? Are we seeing?
Boom! It jumped up. There you go.
So I think Sarah's got a perhaps even better version of this, but I think we all recognize the problem of vote splitting. So there's 2 candidates that most people like. They split the vote very often, and a third one that a lot less people like wins, and that's our current plurality system. So ranked choice voting looks somewhat like this, and this is a little one I pulled from another organization of some candidates in the Democratic primary, where you're not just like sitting there sweating, which one do I vote for? You'd be like, oh, I like this one first, that one second, this one third. And although COVID's kind of covered up a lot of the news coverage and even just analysis of this so far, got a lot of great feedback from this from the primary states that were using it, where people were really excited to be able to be like, well, I know this candidate's not going to win, but I love them. And they'd vote for them first. And then they're like, and I like this candidate too. And they felt really happy about being able to simply choose the order of candidates that they liked. And this is sort of what a ballot would look like with the candidates listed in first choice, second choice. There's a bunch of variations on these ballots. This one we just use for simplicity's sake, because a lot of places in America that use this, the ballots look somewhat like this.
Great, thank you. And Sarah, can you share your slide with us?
Yeah. So can you all see this?
Yes, go ahead.
So that's a sample ballot, and it's a good example as well of vote splitting and that spoiler effect that Mike was talking about. Here we've got one bad guy, Darth Vader, and he's running against a whole bunch of good guys. We've got the Rebel Alliance, we've got the Jedi, and in our current system, what you would usually have happen is that even though a majority opposed Darth Vader, the good guys split the vote, and they could even lose the election because of it. So with Star voting, the 2 highest scoring candidates are finalists. So in this case, Darth Vader actually is the highest scoring, but if you were to add up the total scores from all of the good guys, you would see that, you know, good wins, good should win. And then looking at any one ballot, you figure out which finalist was preferred. This voter preferred Luke Skywalker over Darth Vader. And Luke Skywalker wins by a majority.
Got it. Great. Thank you. Thank you both for that. That's really helpful. Let's just jump down to our questions. From Lieutenant Thelen, thanks for joining us again today. Sara and Mike, what do you think the next Oregon's next Secretary of State can or should do to promote these voting methods in Oregon?
Should I go first on that, or?
Yeah, I forget where we're at, so go ahead, jump in.
Yeah, so for me, what I'm really looking for as a voter and as an activist, I'm the executive director of the Equal Vote Coalition. So as an organization, what we really want is voting methods that don't play favorites, where every voter has an equal vote. No matter how many candidates are in the election, every voter has an equal say. There's no implicit bias in the outcomes. And that is something that voting reform can change dramatically. But for me as a voter, I really am looking for two things: political courage, the ability to lead on an issue that maybe isn't a majority opinion yet because people haven't had the opportunity to learn about it. And then somebody who's willing to actually do their homework and come to an educated, unbiased, open-minded, fact-based, scientifically sound opinion. So
thank you. And
the issue, and I don't think every voter has time to dig into the ins and outs of it, but our leadership should.
Yeah, and let me bump this over to Mike and just say also that I'm not asking about the candidates in the debate, because I want to keep that separate from this conversation, but just whoever next sits in that seat, that their role specifically. So we're not talking about election season, we're talking about the leadership in the next role. Mike, let me bump that over to you. Any additional thoughts?
So, I mean, we're currently exploring what implementation would look like in terms of like policy, what the appetite for voters, what the appetite for from elected officials and organizations that represent labor, workers, organizations that represent women running for office, communities of color. We're having that conversation now. I think overall, being an active participant in that process of thinking through this, identifying if there is money that needs to go to upgrading machines, where that would come from, through the policy and implementation, working with county clerks to make sure they have the resources they need to feel like they're supported in this election. Because I think a big, huge, important point on this is not just passing this, right? A lot of people focus on the sort of campaign side of these things and the policy side of these things, but the voter side of these things is absolutely got to be front and center of mind in terms of educating people of like, why is this important? Whether you're scoring or ranking or whatever, if you're making a change in the election system, voters need to understand baseline how it works and why it's important to rank or score more than just their favorite candidate. Because in times that, ranked choice voting has been around for a while, some of the early implementation problems came from a lack of voter education. And it doesn't need to be expensive or complex, but it needs to be done and done well. So I would think partnering with the Secretary of State's office on that will be absolutely critical.
Well, I appreciate both of those comments, and I think both of these methods provide an opportunity to move forward to better capture voter preference. And I love the example you gave with the two babies and but also I know, Sara, you had a Darth Vader one that was very equivalent to that. And I think that is such a strong point to say we could do better in how we understand voter intent and voter preference. And so what I would do is be part of that process of making sure we were rolling out, having these kind of conversations across our state. So Oregon voters can really get a sense of what's the difference, what are the options? What do we have now? What are the other options? What's the difference between them? And so they can come to their own mind and come to their own conclusion about which is the best system. Because I'm really impressed with both of them. Both of them have really strong strengths. And then once voters decide on that, the point you hit home on, Mike, I think is really key, because I'd seen some of this ranked choice voting has been along for a longer time. And I saw some case of it with some of the early implementation where they struggle with just the thing you talked about, where voters need to understand the system in place. That's true with our current system as well. So, I think the role, the responsibility of anyone in either the Secretary of State or also our legislators when they're looking at looking at making decisions about how we vote. Let's make sure we have something that engages as many people as possible, that reduces any barriers to people participating, and then understanding the intent of voters so that people can choose their leadership and move forward. That's the real core and heart of this, I think. But I appreciate both those comments. From Side, here's a second question. Do both star and ranked choice voting eliminate the need for primaries?
So do you want to go first, Mike? Just because I did last time.
Yeah,
Sure.
why don't we do that? Sorry.
So again, I think Sarah and I are coming from slightly different perspectives on this in terms of just what our organizations are doing. So we're exploring this. Ranked choice voting is flexible. It could be a way to eliminate primaries. That is one way that it's been used. It can eliminate runoff elections. It can also be layered over primaries. So in a primary, you can rank your candidates. In the general, you can rank your candidates. There's various ways that this system can be sort of applied to elections, from just baseline ranking candidates and over the existing system through more in-depth things. I mean, one of the sort of golden like North Star reforms is proportional representation, and ranked choice voting mixed with that, with like various forms of multi-member districts or other thing, actually lead to incredibly equitable outcomes. The nice thing about ranked choice voting is it can be done as a standalone and then act as a pathway to even bigger reforms in the future once the electorate is sort of more comfortable with really rethinking through how we elect people to office.
Yeah, and just building on that, star voting as well is really adaptable. So it's not our role to say, here's what your election process needs to look like. We're just giving people a tool to accurately express their preference and their level of support. So star voting also can be used for single winner elections, for multi-winner elections where you elect, the top 3 candidates to the 3 seats in a multi-member district. Or it can be tabulated much like with ranked choice voting for proportional representation election, where if you have a quarter of the electorate that supports one candidate or one ideology, they would win a quarter of the seats available for office. And so that's a really powerful kind of set of 3 options: single winner, basic multi-winner, proportional representation. And then when you throw in the question about what do we want to do with primaries, what we suggest is that if you need a primary, great. You better have a voting method that's accurate with multiple candidates in the race. And that's where star voting really shines. For elections like local elections across Oregon are mostly done in nonpartisan races. So for nonpartisan races, we really can just move it all to the general election when we have much higher turnout and get more representative, inclusive elections with better results.
Great, thanks. And we are almost out of time. Actually, we're running a little bit over. There is a question, so let me know if this is a simple answer or this is a part of a much longer conversation. But someone said these are really interesting ideas. Do you think that giving voters options like these will increase turnout? Sarah, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I absolutely think it will. Like
Great.
I said, the upcoming primary election is starting Tuesday for independent and non-affiliated voters. Those are voters that are really excluded a lot, but with a system like star voting or preference voting, whether or not you're in a major party, you can vote, express your opinions, and count on that your vote is not going to be wasted. So that's really inspiring.
Yeah, thanks. And Mike?
Yeah,
increasing voter turnout.
There's absolutely demonstrated evidence across the country that ranked choice voter turnout has increased under ranked choice voting. So there's plenty of examples of that. A lot of that's tied to voter education, but where it's been implemented well, which is most places in recent history that it's been implemented, you will see people using, the exit polls will show up to 98% voter approval of this. It's always overwhelmingly approved of by voters. Voters really like this when they've been given some level of understanding of what it is, and that increases every election that they use it in. And voters, again, when you do it correctly with some education in partnership with implementation, voters overwhelmingly choose to rank candidates too. And what we've seen is not only increased turnout, but we've seen sort of increased turnout of candidates as well, because it reduces negativity in campaigning, because people want to be people's second choice, so they're not a jerk. and it also reduces the barrier of money because people focus more on issue-based, coalition-based campaigning than they do under plurality voting. So what that creates is a less toxic political atmosphere for everybody. So voters like it better, they show up more, they feel empowered. And what we see is things like city councils, instead of like 25% women, like they are in most cities in the country, they're up to 50% women under ranked choice voting. We see huge increases in not enough of an increase to get us fully down the line, but we see huge increases of like 20% on average, I think, of candidates of color winning in ranked choice voting under the circumstances.
Excellent. Well, hey, thanks. We're out of time. Thank you both so much. Can you please share some information, either a website or some way that people can get more information about these two types of voting, or contact you directly? Mike, would you kick us off?
Sorry, could you say that again? Share
what? With information, how to either learn more about ranked choice voting or to contact you directly. And we can also put something in the link, but if you could just share with our listeners.
Sure. I would say fairvote.org is a great place. The League of Women Voters have some information about it. Represent Women is an organization that's working on electoral reform that deals with this. Represent.us is another organization that we've recently partnered with. Although, and I think that's an interesting one too, because I think some of the local chapters are supporting STAR. So there's kind of, you can kind of see how these groups are overlapping. Those would be the ones I'd say. And then I'll throw my email address if anybody has questions in there as well, for anyone who wants to look or for more information.
Thank you so much. And yeah, I know there's a much larger and deeper conversation with these two. There's so much more information. So those are a good place for folks to go. And Sarah, what are some ways that people can learn more about STAR voting or contact you directly?
Yeah, so for STAR voting, the website is starvoting.us. For our nonprofit, the organization behind STAR voting is Equal Vote Coalition, and I'm the executive director of that. That's dedicated to research and advocacy around equality in voting and equity in general. And so that's equal.vote is the website there. And then to actually use STAR voting in your own polling, in your own elections, public or private, star.vote is the STAR voting election tool.
Excellent.
And to vote in the Independent Party of Oregon upcoming primary, the link to that is really accessible from the Independent Party of Oregon website.
And what's their website?
I think
we'll stick that in the comments.
But yeah,
we'll stick that in the comments. Great. Well, Sarah and Mike, thank you both so much. Building a healthier and stronger democracy really starts with engaging in these kind of conversations and forming voters. So thanks for doing your bit today to build a stronger and healthier democracy. Thanks for the information on your, for getting more information as well. So those websites, we'll shout those out to folks and get that in the comments. All of you who joined us on this, thank you so much for joining us. My name is Jamie McLeod-Skinner. I'm running to be Oregon's next Secretary of State. You can find out more information on me at jamiefororegon.com and on social media at Jamie McLeod-Skinner for Oregon. Really appreciate folks joining us. We've got hot topics on Monday, Wednesday, Friday at noon with information on the Secretary of State's role. Also, these Oregon Voices Roundtable to talk about what does accountable government look like to communities around Oregon and how can people be better engaged. And then also we're having town halls to bring attention to regional candidates throughout the state. Thanks for joining us. Stay safe. And despite the fact we're now in challenging times with COVID-19, we'll get through this together. So thanks, everyone.